This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Chris Heivly. He has a book out called Build the Fort, the Startup Community Builder's Field Guide. A lot of topics in this conversation, from startups to entrepreneurs to venture capital to the dot-com bubble to Netscape going public to MapQuest to America Online, commercial office space. A lot of different topics here. But ultimately, at the heart of it, at the root of it, a conversation about entrepreneurism, a conversation about being an entrepreneur, that entrepreneurial thinking. Chris has some interesting experiences, some great insights, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. So Chris, I'm going to take you back in time a little bit here. I think what you originally became known for is a hell of an interesting story. And I did not realize how far back MapQuest goes. I guess the starting of it before it got to the digital world goes back some bit of time. I grew up in the Northern Virginia area, so I have a keen memory of that AOL disk in April 1994, and AOL was all the rage in Northern Virginia back in the day. There's still residual there. The guy that owns the Washington Wizards came from AOL, Leonsis, and all that kind of stuff. But why don't you take me back in time and maybe give a little bit of a background on MapQuest itself and when you came into the picture and how that all unfolded. I'm sure there's a story here that I'm digging for that I don't even know yet, but you're going to share some wisdom.
I'm a storyteller and we're a catcher of stories. So I can tell you that I think this story is pretty non-traditional and pretty unique. I'm happy to share it with you and have you have a few aha moments. I'll start with my journey. I'm probably the only geographer you've ever met in your life.
That's true.
So I have an undergraduate and a graduate degree in geography. I still remember my father's face when I told him as an undergrad I was going to be a geography major. And this look was like, well, what the heck are you ever going to do with that? But it turns out, like many of us, there was one class and one professor that lit my fire, and that was a computer mapping class. Now, let me be clear. Computer at the time was a mainframe somewhere in some building long, far away. The whole interface was like a printer.
What year are we talking?
Like probably 1980. So what that means is there's no desktop PCs. There's no visual interface, right? Everything's on this printer. It's kind of right after computer cards. What interested me was that this was at the very, very, very beginning. And I think this becomes a trend through the rest of my life. I like to be on the bleeding edge of stuff. So here I was as a student, and I had this professor who was no more than a half step in front of me. So we kind of bonded together as a professor and student to go figure this stuff out. Nights spent over at this computer lab with people going, why are you here, you geographer? And in fact, he encouraged me to take somewhere like 12 hours of computer science credit. So I actually learned how to code as a geographer. Not surprising today, very surprising in 1980 when the only people who knew how to code were computer science people.
I can't remember the first web application where you could really use online mapping, but I know Netscape went public in the summer of 1995. So we're talking 15 years ahead of time.
Yeah, very much so. I went to graduate school 9 days after I graduated as an undergrad. And the reason was there was only 3 universities in the US that had a computer mapping. We now call that GIS, Geographic Information Systems. I tell people I was into GIS before we called it GIS. And when I showed up in graduate school in the research lab where I was going to work, the director said, here's an Apple Lisa and here's an IBM PC that had only come out a year before, the first desktop really computers. I heard you know how to code, make them draw maps. What I'm painting a picture is I was really into this early on.
Jump me ahead a little bit. You give that great foundation, but there's going to be, I can imagine, in that 15-year gap, because I still remember myself, there wasn't much terribly exciting happening in the 80s. There was no internet connectivity. Everything was pretty rudimentary. I mean, it was cool for the day, but the excitement really didn't happen until 1995. What starts to become the process of you being at MapQuest? We might now have a way to really reach people with this technology.
Yeah, so let's jump ahead to late 80s, early 90s. I go and join a mapping company headquartered in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. They're part of a $6 billion printing company. They make maps for National Geographic and the Park Service and textbooks and phone books. And we decide that there's an interesting opportunity. And this really starts the MapQuest journey. We weren't called MapQuest at the time, but late 80s, early 90s, we put all of this routing technology, how to go from city to city. And for any of those people that are probably older than, 40 or 50, instead of this triptych that you got from the auto clubs, we decided that we would disrupt that. We loaded all that on a desktop PC and a laser printer, very expensive at the time, and we rolled that into the back offices of every auto club in the country. That started us on this journey. So the way, Michael, I like to tell the MapQuest story is that it's really just us following the technology.
And then ultimately following the technology, but then at that moment, when everyone saw Netscape go public and everyone was like, uh-oh, now we've got an audience. Now we can reach everybody.
Yeah, exactly. I guess the other little interesting thing with respect to mapping is before, when you wanted routing technology, which roads to take, you had to go to a professional, you had to go to an office, you had to go to a service. In 1993, when the CD-ROM came out, we were the first ones to put it all in a CD-ROM, and now you could do it at home. So the movement for us was also about putting the power into your hands as opposed to relying on someone else. And then February 96, we released the website, MapQuest. The company was called something different at the time, but the internet was just the next evolution. But every time along this way, our technology was getting smaller and tighter and putting the power in your hands.
1994 was pivotal for me. I had just finished grad school and just exposed to AOL for the first time. So I do recall in the summer of 1994, I was still going to a AAA office to get a triptych. Maybe it was the only and last one I got. I'm not sure, but I remember going and doing it in that whole process of, it's the same process. If a young person today wants to imagine how crazy it was and how bureaucratic and how silly it was, imagine walking into a Bank of America today to do a deposit and all the old people are in there with nothing to do in a Bank of America or a Citibank. The typical local retail bank or the post office. That's what getting a triptych felt like.
I think the analogy is perfect, Michael. And yeah, that was probably about the last time for you, because all of a sudden you realized you could do it yourself and not have to wait, and you can control your outcome.
Let me jump you ahead to AOL really starts rocking and rolling. By 96, I don't know the exact numbers, but I'm sure they were already king of the hill. And of course, by the late 90s, whenever they made their big acquisition, for those out there paying attention, at that point in time, there was a lot of search engines, and the main search engine was not Google. It's probably Alta Vista or InfoSeek or Excite, etc. But speak to me about the moment where you start to realize, okay, we've got this technology, we've done it. No one else is really able to compete with us at this moment. And now AOL is sniffing around. Unfold some of this.
They were the big dogs at the time, which is also a lesson how almost all the kings eventually fail. They were an advertising-based company. Advertising was based on how many pages you produce. And it turns out that MapQuest and the service produces a lot of pages, which means a lot of advertising. The last 3 years, I was sitting on the board of directors, and I left in 1999, right before we took public. We hired a CEO, pretty savvy, than my old partner who helped build the service. And remember, we didn't just have the internet site. We also had still CD-ROMs. We had map services. We had a very complex business at the time with lots of different revenue streams. We take it public. We needed adults on the board. That's a very big deal in 1999. A year later, AOL buys it off the public markets for $1.2 billion. We were doing probably about 30 million in revenue, losing about 30 million a year, which was the perfect model for an internet company to go public at that time.
The fact that you were making any money and going public would have, at that point in time, if we look back, I guarantee it was unique. So many of those companies went public with zero revenue.
Yeah. And by the way, we were really the only game in town because for our listeners here, Google Maps didn't come till 9 years later.
To go kind of broad on that point in time in history, here you are, you're a part of a company that's actually doing something for real. Was there ever a part of you where you looked around from that 95 to 99 period? I know I did. I felt this long before anything popped because, I mean, some of the dumbest people I knew in Northern Virginia were involved in technology. And I was like, well, I know these people are not involved in technology. And this is not a criticism. Obviously, technology has changed the world and everything. But the dot-com bubble surely had a lot of fraud brewing in it. And you must have had a feeling for that as you were moving through, because, you know, you're coming through at a unique experience where you have this valuable asset that is going digital. It's the dot-com era. It must have been unique for you thinking to yourself, gosh, we've got something here that's real. And then there's so much vaporware out there. On the insiders must have known that so much of it was vaporware in hindsight, whether they admit that today or not.
Totally. So I think the other element to add to this, Michael, is that I believe during the late 90s, the number of venture capitalists tripled.
Management fees is a good business, though.
It's a great business, especially when you can overlap funds and double down on your management fees. What I saw from my vantage point, in 1999, I started running a corporate venture fund for our largest shareholder in MapQuest. And during that time, when I sat on the MapQuest board, right, this is kind of in the late 90s, I'm looking at venture capitalists who had no operating experience whatsoever, who had no idea of the challenges of running and building and scaling a company. And I just said, this is going to burst. Not only are they investing, but they're advising companies with no scaling experience whatsoever. Obviously, some of them are good, but I think most of them were not very good. So it's really putting good money into not just bad investments, but then bad advice and bad decisions. And that didn't rest well with me.
Paint a picture, the IPO for MapQuest, the sale to AOL. I mean, these are great situations.
I was off the board by then before we took it public. So I didn't see this.
I'm assuming you had shares or whatnot still in the company, or I'm assuming that when the company went IPO, when it was purchased by AOL, there must have been people inside MapQuest that made a hell of a lot of money. Did that situation, given that point in time in history, when there was a lot of Mark Cuban, Dan Snyder that owns the Washington football team, some guys came out of that era that just made some hellacious trades in the IPO part. Did you walk away with, at that point, where you could say, you know what, I can go drink pina coladas for the rest of my life, or this is not enough for me, I'm going to have to keep going?
This is not enough for me, I need to keep going. And Michael, the reason is that remember in the beginning of the story that MapQuest was not a startup among itself. It was baked inside of a large company. When you have that kind of situation, you typically don't have the founder shares that you would have had if you had started from scratch. So the exit for all of us was healthy, but not Mark Cuban-esque.
Here's the interesting thing about Mark Cuban is that a lot of that was just his trading, getting out of Yahoo, or this isn't a criticism of Mark, but if you were to replay it, there's a chance that that period in time, people could have made a one-day different trade or something. And it was so wild the way things turned out. Things could have been dramatically different for people in that era.
Michael, I agree with you 100%. I think the smartest thing Mark Cuban did is not selling to Yahoo, but shorting Yahoo with his shares, having a feeling like that bubble was coming. If he brought his whole life down to one decision, I think that's the decision he would talk about.
The Bitcoin folks out there, the ones that I guess came of generation post the great financial crisis, they are not going to remember or recall most likely. But the Bitcoin savant at that time, his company did something completely different. Michael Saylor went on 60 Minutes. I think it was Leslie Stahl. And I think he said something to the effect, and at the time he might have been worth $10 billion on paper. MicroStrategy had gone to the moon. And he said something to the effect I'm paraphrasing, he was going to personally control the healthcare of all Americans. And the stock essentially crashed the next day. The NASDAQ bubble crashed within 2 to 3 months. That was the trigger. I think that's fair, right?
Yeah. And I think there's more of those moments than we realize.
Let me keep it at something like venture capital. We lay this foundation because I look at the dot-com era. Okay, we get out of the dot-com era. We're still flat on our back in the fall of 2002. There's no real growth. The Fed has cut rates down. Okay, we know what happens next. The Big Short movie. That gets us to 09. And we get to 09 and there's some accounting changes and we get to zero interest rate policy. And that gets us to 2020, COVID. It feels like to me that we've been playing kick the can down the road for the dot-com era since the end of the dot-com era. And we still feel like we're doing it because we haven't escaped it. Or is that my own imagination?
Kick the can down the road implies that there's some grand awakening coming. And I just think of it more like a series of cycles that kind of cleanses itself every X number of years. And people get ahead of ourselves. And I think the reason people do that is that there's an inherent greed in trying to figure out how to trick the system. And eventually the system catches up. Out of this, great companies are built, great opportunities. And I'm a technologist first and a capitalist second. But those two things combined means that we get to where we get. I think there was hype around the phrase Web3. It doesn't do anything for me. It's just the next evolution. But now all of a sudden, AI is in our pocket. That's the next hype cycle, as maybe Gartner would call it. And we've been through, 3 or 4 of these in our adult lifetime? There had to be a good, 12 years maybe between versions of this at one point. So here we are again. And probably happen at least once more in our lifetime.
How do you see coming out of, let's say, FTX, watching the cozy relationships with some venture capital firms, watching some of the banks in Silicon Valley have trouble spring of 2023? Where are we right now? It doesn't feel like the prettiest of last couple of years, does it?
No, it doesn't. It feels like we're at or around the peak of hype, and that hype becomes more important than substance. Michael, it's the reason I've never lived in New York or the Valley. That's not the game that I want to play personally. Nothing's that great, nothing's that terrible, but you kind of muscle through these things. I'm still a builder at my heart, and I still want to build real things that do real things, real value for real people. This hype first and substance later kind of mindset, that eventually it busts, right?
It does. And it seems like to me that so much of fund management world, I've written books about a particular trading strategy, and that involves fund management as well, but in the venture capital fund management world as well, that so many of these pension funds around the country, around the world, representing typically the public employee, so many of these funds seem to have developed these cozy relationships. I know, look, everyone's chasing yield. I've had people tell me, I think on this show and perhaps off the record, that a huge number, and I know this doesn't apply to you. I know you don't think this way. I can see that in your world and your writing, but it does seem like a significant number of venture capitalists have figured out, well, hey, if we can get the Chicago firemen's money and throw it into a big fund, we're going to spin off great management fees. Whether or not we actually get to a fantastic startup that changes the world is immaterial, because we're just going to make a hell of a lot of money. Tell me if I'm wrong on any of these assessments, or correct me, add to it.
I'm not a fan of the system. I'm not a fan of basically mediocre venture capitalists with no operating experience or scaling experience going into a company, taking someone else's money, the fireman's money, and saying, listen, we're going to make huge bets. We only want home run swings, because if the worst case that happens is I'm going to sit and collect fees over at least 2 funds, that's 8 years, and make enough money there to live a high life. And then, by the way, if I get lucky, more because I'm lucky than good, the downside is I didn't lose any of my money. I collected these unbelievable fees, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, overlapping sometimes when you have multiple funds. The only people that get hurt are the firemen.
You want to go back to the basics and build companies, help people to learn how to do that. But let me start at a real basic as we kind of pivot away from some kind of ancient history discussion. I think it's useful for people to have some foundation, but you have a philosophical view, psychological view, perhaps. Speak to the adult mindset and how you see it in terms of the hindrances. I continually think of myself as a teenager in terms of my thinking, or at least in terms of being curious. I had a conversation with a friend the other day, and we were talking about exercise, and he was younger than I was by 4 or 5 years. And he immediately started telling me he couldn't do this and he couldn't do that, and he had this problem and that problem. And I was just thinking, what the hell? You just fix the problems. You don't make excuses. I'm wondering if that's a little bit of the adult mindset that you also don't like.
At a very basic level, I think as adults, we carry so much baggage with us, and that baggage ultimately gets in the way of us doing great things. Everyone's an expert in something, and you have the ability to manifest that self if you can get out of your own way. And I think the baggage we bring as adults in terms of expectations of ourselves, what our role is in society, how we're supposed to operate in that mode, I think that's what kind of crushes us. And not unlike your friend who feels like a victim, right? I can't fix this. Well, why not? Your grandparents did. They fixed everything that they needed to fix. They just kept moving on. My mindset is more like when you get in these places, if you can stop for a second, channel back to your 10 or 12-year-old, release a lot of the baggage, the expectations, just connect on a real basis, the kind of basis you did when the best friends you had when you were 12. I think you get a lot more done. Maybe you're happier. Maybe you're healthier. You can have a fantastic life, I think, if you can kind of operate in that mode more often.
The way the American system is still structured is, okay, if you get to high school and you get really good grades, and some kids, I was not one of these trusting kids. I was a little more skeptical of the idea that I was going to have to memorize everything for 4 years to compete with Bob over next to me who loved memorizing. I thought to myself, well, this isn't learning. This is memorizing. What the hell am I doing? This is not exciting. I'm bored out of my mind. But there are those enterprising kids that figure out that the way you are graded as a youngster is just to memorize everything. And if you memorize enough, you get fantastic SAT scores and you get into Stanford or Harvard. Then what happens? You do the same process in Stanford or Harvard, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee a damn thing. I'd much rather bet on a young person that says, hey, I'm going to go try and start a business at age 18 than I want to bet on a kid that thinks they've got a great resume at the end of 4 years at some college.
Well, I probably took a similar track than you, Michael. I've never been the smartest. I've never been a great memorizer. I think your career is the culmination of all your experiences, and that the more experiences you get, the better you are. And you get to be put in situations where you got to figure your way out of that hole. And by the way, I think most of those people with perfect grades and perfect memorization who went to those perfect schools became VCs.
They figured out it was just another extension of figuring out the system. But you know what? I think if you go through life that way, you miss something. You miss some kind of feeling. You miss some kind of, I really did something. I changed something. I learned something, versus just allowing the system to carry you through. You know, I got great grades. I went to Harvard. Goldman Sachs picked me up. I ended up at some Sand Hill Road VC, and boom, 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 boom. And now I'm just a big swinging whatever. And it's all fake to me. I mean, that's just my humble opinion, regardless of how rich somebody might get.
There's probably a few people that would love to change places, but I think you and I are of similar thoughts in that many people, I would say, think that if you're an entrepreneur, you're a risk taker. And I got to tell you, I'm one of the less risky people you ever met for someone who's been an entrepreneur most of their life. I've had at least 3 or 4 kind of life pivots where I've probably gone in a completely different direction. There's energy, there's passion, there's a lot of life when you're going to try to do something new and put yourself in a new situation. And I don't do it with risk intent. I do it because this is the life that I enjoy and gives me energy. And I think it also taught my kids how to do that, because they could see me have the ups and downs and the challenges. And I wouldn't change this life for anything.
If they are using risk taker as a pejorative, it's only because they think it's a risk not to do what they're doing. it's a risk to them because they look at you or they look at me or they look at whoever and they say, well, you're taking a risk because you're not working for the man. You don't have the typical corporate job. You're not going down that life track. You're trying to get outside of that world.
Yeah, I guess at some level, Michael, I didn't have any other choice. That's who I am. So I guess I was lucky enough early on to figure out this is who I am and this is the life that I need to be fulfilled. I have two brothers. Both of them have only had a couple jobs in their lives, and they kind of work for government or a large corporation. And I don't judge them. I just know that's not my life. I think at least one of them looks at my life and says, wow, how do you do that? And I wonder if I could do that. And the answer is we could all do it. You just have to choose to do it and embrace that little bit of chaos and all of that, as opposed to being in fear of it.
I put my first website up in October of 96. Made no money the first 6 months, but I had credit card processing, handling educational courses in the trading world in early 97. And my business was profitable in early 97. So sometimes I look back, I'm like, man, that was really early. And I was completely outside of it because everyone else I knew at the time was, I mean, you guys had a story. We had a real business, but everyone I knew at the time was like just doing smoke and mirrors. And I was actually making money and had real money to live on versus somebody giving me venture capital. I was actually doing something real, but.
Congratulations to you.
Obviously, there's always a little bit of luck on things. I knew when Netscape went public, I was like, this is changing everything. And I have to have a website up. Even if I don't have the content figured out yet, I have to get out there. I have to be out there. I just instinctively knew that there was a certain first mover urgency. Let me bring you into the idea of startup communities. This is not something I'm terribly familiar with. I've had Brad Feld on the podcast, who you know, but speak to the idea of whatever city it might be. I happen to be in Saigon, Vietnam. I know there is a startup community here. I don't know much about it, but I've had conversations with venture capitalists and whatnot, especially from the States that are trying to find young, aggressive coders here in Saigon that are building things. But speak to what you have learned and maybe even explain what the idea of a startup community is. It's usually something that's going to be geographic dependent on that particular city and the community of people there. But why don't you speak to and explain it and how it operates within a city?
Yeah, you're right. This has been my passion for the last, depending on how I want to count, 6 to 10 years. 10 years in my own community of Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, 10 to 12, 13 years now, and 6 years as a purveyor, consultant, coach, whatever. Let me start with a little bit of the why. The why is that there's not a city in the world of 250,000 people and above that doesn't realize that part of their economic viability is having a healthy and robust entrepreneurial ecosystem, that job growth and all of that brings. And especially we're talking about high growth, high tech companies, as opposed to kind of Main Street businesses. In fact, the Main Street businesses usually follow to support the population around big companies, right? So there's not a city in the world that doesn't want that or understand that it's really important. To me, what a startup community is a group of people, actors we call them, that play multiple roles in helping to build those high growth companies. So they're the entrepreneurs themselves. They're the serial entrepreneurs, the ones who've already done it 2, 3, 4 times. They're the investors. They're the business people who serve as advisors and mentors. There's economic development folks at city, state, federal levels who want to encourage this. University researchers and instructors in entrepreneurship, even media, from bloggers to podcasters to traditional magazine and newsprint. All of these people play a role and are all part of that community that's focused on how do we inspire and support entrepreneurs on their journey from an idea to hopefully building a great big company. From a personal point of view, Michael, my interest in this is that I've been an entrepreneur myself working on my own projects. You become an investor, so now you're investing in other projects, and now maybe you're getting into not just your stuff, but others. The next thing in that journey for me is I can help a lot of entrepreneurs by helping their leaders in their city. I can help them build an environment from which, as an entrepreneur, hopefully I can be more successful and make better decisions. This startup community It's a little amorphous. It's got lots of actors, and those actors can wear multiple hats, but how they come together to help and support each other can be a wonderful experience. And to me, that's this Silicon Valley thing. That's what the goal is in every community. We want to be able to help people and avoid the brain drain for those people having to go to New York or the Valley or Boston, et cetera.
It's a completely different issue, but these days in America, our big cities are not at their best right now. And from a livability standpoint, who in their right mind really wants to deal with a lot of the on the ground things that are happening in American cities? It's not pleasant. It's not fun. So if somebody could find a geographic independent location, so to speak, where they like where they are, they like the people in that area, isn't that what all this technology was supposed to do to begin with? I still remember driving up the Dulles Corridor in 1996 and 7. I'm thinking to myself, why are they still building all of these office buildings? What is the purpose? Why are we still building office buildings? And it only took 25 more years before we now realized, oh, now we built too many office buildings.
Yeah, you were before your time, I'm sure, in thinking that. You know, it's ultimately the democratization of entrepreneurship, of capital, of resources. It was happening already. I think COVID and the pandemic really supersized this. I mentioned earlier, I've never lived in New York or the Valley, and I've spent tons of airplane time going to those places. But every day, I think that spread, that democratization spreads to other cities. And we have places like Seattle and Berlin and Singapore and London, even places that are coming up like Raleigh-Durham, Austin, Texas. It's obvious you can build decent-sized companies and eventually great big companies in those places, and you don't have to go to London or New York or San Francisco to do that. That is unbelievable. What an opportunity for people who don't want to pick up and migrate.
But it's not novel to you or me.
No.
You've known this forever.
We've been working this for most of our adult lives. I've never lived in those places. I've lived in Chicago, probably the biggest city I lived in, but I left in 2005 because I'm going to tell you, they still didn't know how to spell internet 2005, 10 years later. I couldn't get anything done there. And so I had to come to a different place.
I remember being in Chicago. I think it was 95, 96. I was helping out a big trading event where this very famous trader was going to speak. And we were in this big ballroom in a downtown Chicago hotel room. And they needed someone to walk across the hall. There was like 5 of us in the ballroom to walk across the ballroom and turn the light on. And I said, where's the switch? And someone pointed over there. So I start to walk the 25 meters over to turn the switch. All hell broke loose that I was going to turn the light switch on. No shit. They had to call in a union employee. I'm not having a union employee negative conversation here, but this is my one and only experience. I had to wait 15 minutes for them to call in a union employee who came over and flipped the switch up with his finger. No shit, that actually happened.
Crazy.
So when you talk about Chicago and the internet, yes, I've seen things too. It's crazy.
To anybody who's a disruptor of things, AKA every entrepreneur, we just look at that and say, that's friction that I don't want or need. I'm going to go somewhere else.
Let me flip it to something, and I'm going to bring it back to some of the key things that you are really addressing. But I'm curious your perspective on this. So I would assume, our most famous entrepreneur of the modern 2023 age, Mr. Musk, buying Twitter and then summarily firing, 80% of the staff. I see that as a data point. And then in the last year, I start to see these videos of these very attractive young ladies doing these walk and talks as they arrive to Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever. And they eat a snack and they play foosball and they walk around and the building's nice and they're drinking and they're partying. It's all this kind of stuff. So then I bring it back to Elon and the staff cutting. How much is his movement to cut staff? How much has that reverberated in the startup world? Because I would guess if he could do it, a lot of other people could cut deeply as well.
Well, we've seen those cuts across the board from just about every major tech company today. So he's not alone in that.
Not as deep as he's gone though, right?
Probably not relative to the total, but he's cut pretty deeply. And everything that I understand, I want to make sure I bring it back to your question about startups, but everything I understand about most of these cuts and most of these companies are that they, in the go days of the last 5 to 10 years, especially the last few years with COVID, they significantly increased their staff. So many of these, it's kind of a rollback. Maybe they've added 10,000, but cut 5,000. With Elon, it's a little different. But I think the message is to many of these people that, all right, great, you've had an experience. For the startup world, I think this is a fantastic thing because these people have sat inside the belly of these beasts, Meta, Google, Microsoft, Twitter. They've sat in the bellies of these beasts. They've understood what it takes. They've seen what are good things, what are bad things. Hopefully, maybe they've seen the silly things like the cappuccino bars and the full cafeterias and say, all right, I'm ready now to do this on my own. I have to do something, right? Because I just got laid off. And I'm thinking that in the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to see a huge lift in high-tech startups that address certain issues that these people fell out of these tech companies. And I'm hoping the ones from Twitter are no different. The question is, where are these people located and where are they going to go?
Lean and mean is always going to be paramount to a startup. I mean, if you're truly coming at it with an entrepreneurial survival mindset, no one walks in and says, let's get the best office space, the foosball table. It's propaganda. It's not real life. That's just if you've got more money than God and you can just blow money, you do that. But real businesses and real people trying to survive and then ultimately thrive do not use their capital that way.
No. And it certainly, by the way, in the tier 2 and tier 3 cities that you and I care about, you can't do that. There's not stupid capital around that instead of raising $500,000, they raise $3 million. So they go get the special offices and the cafeterias and the cappuccino bars and all that kind of stuff. They don't have that money to be that silly. They got to create value and they got to hire people. A much more grounded approach in these tier 2 and tier 3 cities.
You made a point, though, about cities over 250,000, that everyone has to be thinking about this economic development when it comes to startups. Thinking about it is one thing. I know from personal experience, especially growing up in the DC area, seeing a lot of local government and how they make decisions. I mean, they might understand that we've got this certain population and we need to help startups along, but local governments can vary quite a bit from city to city, and mindsets inside local government can vary quite a bit. And especially we bring up the Chicago example. I'm sure it would take a long time for you to explain how you view the landscape of American cities, but they're not all created equal, are they?
Let me say it a different way. They're not all the same. They're very unique. They have many of the same challenges. They have many of the same motivations, but the way they go about trying to make things happen, in this case, create an environment for more startups to be successful, varies, and their approaches varies, and many of them don't kind of approach it with the right mindset.
What city has inspired you the most in, let's say, the last 5 to 10 years, and why have they inspired you?
I'll start with a surprise city that no one would probably mention, Birmingham, Alabama. Obviously not known as a tech hub or an entrepreneurial ecosystem, but I visited there a number of years ago, and I've stayed in contact with many of the leaders there. To me, what they epitomized is what Brad started to write about 12 years ago with his first book, Startup Communities. They really embody the spirit of collaboration and support with the understanding that their quote unquote clients or their users or customers, whatever you want to call them, the entrepreneurs have to be at the center of all of their activities. What I saw there was this extremely collaborative, cross-functional, from the mayor to the co-working space to the university to serial entrepreneurs, everyone sitting in the same room with the same goal, which is how can I make our local startups more successful? And it may sound cliche-ish, or maybe it sounds a little overly simplistic or kumbaya, but I'm going to tell you that's going to play out over the next 5 to 10 years. And if you and I are doing this update 10 years from now, we'll be talking about Birmingham, the little secret that no one knew about, doing unbelievable things because they're building a great foundation from which to do so. If I can, let me juxtapose that, and I won't name a city per se, but Many cities I go into, there's quite the opposite of collaboration and support. It's the economic development folks or the local entrepreneurial service organization that's funded by a foundation or a company or a group of people. Those people saying, I'm going to be the king or the CEO of the ecosystem, and I'm going to control our activities, and I'm going to dictate how people access knowledge and capital, and I'm going to be this hub that everyone has to go through to get things done. And I'm going to tell you, it doesn't work, and it breaks.
That doesn't sound fun at all. And ultimately, there does have to be a fun component to all of this too, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's so funny that you mentioned fun, because it's not been lack of money or motivation for cities to want to emulate or try to meet the Silicon Valley standard. People have spent across the globe billions of dollars trying to do this in their city collectively. So if it's not money, and Birmingham or Knoxville or London, everyone wants this to happen. So it's not a lack of motivation and it's not the amount of money. Then why don't we have 200 different Silicon Valleys? It's because they get the foundation wrong. They try to engineer success. And let's be honest, if we just had to run the playbook, wouldn't you and I both be the next Mark Zuckerberg? There's not a playbook for success. When you dial that all back to the origins, you cannot overly control or dictate or engineer a successful company. It's got to be fun. It's got to be loose. It's got to be able to pivot. It's got to be able to get the right amount of mentorship at the right amount of time. And all of these things have to conspire together. And even then, there's not a guarantee of success. So now you need to do that not for one or five. You need to do that for hundreds of companies in your city so that you have this pipeline. All of this is equal to a startup community.
I'm going to guess, at least from personal experience, if the startup community is held hostage or overly controlled by local government and or politicians, local government bureaucracy, local politicians, if they are overly controlled by those groups, I'm not putting words in your mouth, but most local governments don't have the experience. They're not business people. It's very political. It's very bureaucratic. Just a completely different animal than the startup world. That's a fair assessment?
Completely different. And let me be clear. Most of the government people I work with have the best of motivations. They're not trying to break things or be bad actors.
It's an experience issue. It's an understanding issue. It's a skill issue. I don't know why anyone would expect government workers or government leaders, politicians to have the skill or understanding or experience in how a startup works. That's not what they do.
Let me be clear in that most of all the government actors I work with have the best of intent and the best of motivations. They're just wired differently. They think differently than an entrepreneur. And so by trying to bring their native muscles and the things that they believe in, which is more about control and hierarchy and structure, all of those things are completely against what an entrepreneur thinks. They're a disruptor of all of those things. By trying to impose that, either accidentally or on purpose, they do the very thing that they're trying not to do, which is they drive those entrepreneurs either back into their homes or to other cities. Because one of the things I say is entrepreneurs don't just decide what they're going to work on or who they're going to work it with or when they're going to launch it. They also decide where. If you're in government, economic development, chambers of commerce, running an organization that's been set up by a private-public partnership, the first thing I try to tell you is, I need you to change your mindset, and I'm going to help you do it. I'm going to coach you through it. And the basis of this, Michael, is very interesting science around systems theory and the idea that these government people have honed their muscles in what we call a complicated system, which is I have to know all the ingredients. I have to know how they work together. I have to put this all together. I need to have people. I need to coordinate, very structured thinking, right? So think about government and large corporations and universities. They're very hierarchical in terms of their structure. You have to work up the chain to get access. Startup communities are complex systems. They're more grassroots. They're more of a network structure than a hierarchical structure. The rules are that you need to build an environment for good things to happen. You need to experiment and iterate. you need to create collisions because none of us know exactly whether that one customer or that one piece of capital or that one piece of advice or mentorship I got is going to be that one little thing that nudges us in a certain direction along this very long and tedious journey. This complex mindset is kind of the opposite of complicated. What I do as a coach and what the book's about is trying to share that mindset and giving you some tactics, maybe adopt a different view of how to do this, how you engage with people, and most importantly, how you support the entrepreneurs first in their journey.
I want to implore upon the audience, and I did this on purpose today just because I knew you had an interesting background. I want to have a wide conversation, but your book, Build the Fort, you get into the nitty gritty. This is truly understanding soup to nuts, A to Z, cradle to grave. And so for people that really want that deep dive, which is what I was not attempting to take you on today, you really do get into the nitty gritty. So I think it's a worthy read for people that really want to understand and want to participate.
Well, thanks for sharing that. Brad was a partner in my work over the last 6 years, and his second book in this, The Startup Community Way, does a fantastic job of setting up the complicated adaptive system approach. And what he and I talked about years ago was that we were going to jam all this in one book, and then we decided to split it into 2 books, that I would do the street version, the tactics. What can I do tomorrow? That was my goal in writing the book. The other thing I'll say is that what's wonderful about the idea of a startup community is that everyone has a role to play. Whether you're an entrepreneur or on your third startup or an investor or at the university, whatever role that you're playing in your current city, this book is to help you play a role in that to the betterment of the community and ultimately the city. So it's not just for people that are maybe doing this full time. Maybe you mentor every so often, or maybe you just attend a coffee meetup, or maybe you're doing research that should be commercialized someday. You need to know how that plays a role in your community for the betterment of you. The approach I hope I got was that there's a role for everyone, and here's the different ways you could play a role.
The book, Build the Fort, the Startup Community Builder's Field Guide. And I think ultimately, just building on what you just said, it's education. It's giving people a chance to see something or learn something without having to make that same mistake. Ultimately, that's what life's all about. If we can sit down with a book or we can sit down with a podcast, can we learn something? Can we avoid something? Because if we all go through life trying to learn everything fresh over again and make every mistake that everyone's come before us made, that's not the best way to go through life.
Not my cup of tea. I want to be smarter. I want to make less mistakes.
Yeah. Hey, Chris, where can we send people? What's the best website to check you out? Book on Amazon, all that kind of fun stuff. Best place they can come find you.
My website, Heivly.com, Heivly.com. I blog some. I talk about my speaking. And then I also have open office hours. You can go, I'll give you anybody 20 minutes. I do a couple hours a week. I meet fantastic people all over the globe. And then obviously the books are available on Amazon. I have a book for doing your own startup called Build the Fort, and then how to start anything. And then the second book is for people who want to play a role in their startup community to the betterment of themselves and their community. And those are the places to find me.
Chris, great stuff. Keep me posted on future books. I appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.